This is Ozzie. He's a 12-week-old Labrador, fox red Labrador puppy, and he's the newest member of our family. So that's why I have been looking at puppy-proofing the garden. When I start a project, I am a journalist, so I do a lot of research. I read quite a few books, I talk to experts, I look online, and I compare the different recommendations that people make. And what I've found is that there are a number of recommendations made. Some are contradictory, and some to me don't seem entirely necessary, but it may be different for you where you live. So I've pulled together all these recommendations and checked things. And I'm going to say which ones I personally think are worth doing. You may make a different decision because you may have a different kind of dog, you may have different issues where you live, and also you may have a different attitude to risk. There were also a couple of other issues that weren't widely mentioned in most of the How to Puppy Proof Your Garden posts and books I read, so I'll cover those as well. The place to start, obviously, is boundaries. We're lucky in that we've got a walled garden, but our previous dog, our darling departed Lottie, could get out the front gate by wriggling under it. And there is the most tiny space under it. So if she, a large adult dog, could get out under the gate, a small puppy would have no problem. It just shows you that you've really got to look at little tiny gaps in your fences if you've got them. The next case is to get rid of sort of sharp and difficult objects. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to get a piece of broken terracotta out of his mouth. He seems to think it's a good thing to chew. So I had to do a good tidy up, make sure there were no loppers, knives, garden tools, somewhere he could get them. Water is always an issue for any kind of young animal or even babies and toddlers. It's really easy for them to fall into some very tiny amount of water and drown. So look at any ponds or mini ponds you have and make sure that they can't access them easily. Another straightforward precaution you can take is to make sure that all household chemicals, including things in the garage or any swimming pool chemicals, and certainly garden chemicals, are out of reach. Things like antifreeze can be particularly dangerous. But now we come to poisonous plants, and I think this is the area that there's probably the most disagreement on. I don't personally think you can actually get all the poisonous plants out of your garden. I was talking about this to a friend of mine who's taught horticulture literally for decades, and he says that he thinks about 20% of any garden is toxic to both human beings and pets. I checked, of course, on the internet, I checked scientific research, I checked books. Eventually the book I've most relied on is Your Labrador Puppy Month by Month, which is a United States book, but it's available here in the UK. And it was given to me by my daughter. And the list of poisonous plants in it really does sound like a garden tour of the middle-sized garden. There's English ivy, hydrangeas, foxgloves, wisteria, box, privet, buttercups, yew, and that's just a few of them. I don't think it's realistic to expect anyone to take all those out of your garden. You might leave one or two behind and not know about it. But what's more, your puppy will have to grow up and meet these plants in other people's gardens, in parks and on walks. So it's really a question, I think, of supervising the garden very closely and making sure he or she doesn't eat any of those plants. Now, as you can see, this particular puppy, and pretty much all puppies, explore everything through their mouths. So he's been eating everything. And the thing that he eats that most worries me wasn't in any of the Puppy Proof Your Garden books. He keeps trying to eat tiny little pieces of black gravel because it looks like his kibble. And I was really quite worried about this, so I asked our vet, and our vet said, oh yes, oh dear. I did have to operate on a dog once which had a whole stomach full of gravel, and he rattled when we put him on the operating table. So it obviously doesn't go right through it. And it's not possible to take every tiny little stone out of your garden. So once again, it's just supervision and hope, I think. One thing which I didn't see mentioned anywhere was the question of bird feeders. Now, even if you use a no-mess bird food, which we do, a lot of the little birds discard some of the seeds and you can get a great pile of grain around your bird feeder. And that, to a greedy Labrador puppy, is manna. And of course he started eating the grain. Now, grain's not particularly good for dogs, and it can make them hyperactive, it can make them overweight, and it can be bad for their digestion. And we've specifically chosen a grain-free puppy food for that reason. So we really didn't want him eating lots of the grain from the bird feeder. It's quite difficult to protect the ground around the bird feeder. Temporarily, we've actually stopped feeding the birds until we can work out a really good alternative. The other thing that wasn't much mentioned in the books, but which he's very keen on, is eating snails. Now, ideally, of course, this would be most wonderful pest control in one's garden, and you would be able to grow hostas if your dog eats snails. But alas, snails can contain, and slugs can contain lungworm, which is very dangerous for dogs. So once again, I've been trying to take it out of his mouth, but it is quite difficult. And there is no question, nobody has ever got rid of all the snails in their garden. And you wouldn't want your dog eating the chemicals that you use to get rid of the snails anyway, would you? However, the good news is that plant poisoning isn't a major cause of poisoning in dogs. The Direct Line Insurance did a study of dogs and cat poisonings here in the UK, and plant poisonings was 4% of all the poisonings. The ones you have to really watch out for, the main one is chocolate, and that also includes cocoa mulch, which you might be using on your garden. And then there are household chemicals, medication and onions, and all of those are more dangerous to your dogs and cats than any of the poisonous plants in your garden. The other bit of good news is that so far he doesn't seem to have mouthed or eaten any of the poisonous plants. He's very keen on chasing magnolia leaves, but I've checked those and they're okay. I saw him go up and sniff a yew, which is very toxic, and he just went away from it. So it is possible that there is some kind of instinctive knowledge in dogs as to what is poisonous and what isn't. But when it's a puppy, you can't wholly rely on that instinctive knowledge. Certainly, neither of our adult dogs ever ate any poisonous plants. But of course, your dog may be particularly attracted to a certain kind of plant. It's probably worth discussing it with your vet and finding out if there's a plant that's particularly attractive to dogs in your area. So what of the advice that I decided not to take? For example, there was one very well-known company, and it suggested that you shouldn't plant borders near your boundaries because dogs check their boundaries and therefore they will be always going through the borders and destroying them. Now, I think this is quite strange advice because I literally visit hundreds of gardens, and pretty much all those gardens have dogs, and pretty much all those gardens have borders next to their boundaries, borders in front of hedges, borders in front of fences. So I'm really not sure that this reflects how people live with gardens and dogs. Once again, possibly this is something that is an issue in a certain part of the world or with a certain breed of dog. Or it may simply be that this particular website was written by people specialising in SEO and they just had to find 10 things to tell us about how to puppy-proof your garden. I'd be interested to know what you think. Another piece of advice I came across, and once again from very well-respected companies, was to plant sturdy plants in your garden. Now, I do understand the thinking behind this, although the sturdy plant it recommended was box, which is actually toxic to pets. So that seemed a bit contradictory. Obviously, a fully grown Labrador running through your borders is going to smash it up a bit. And I think that because Labradors are quite trainable, the route through that is training it not to go in the borders. Our lovely Saluki, Lottie, was not very trainable, but she was very light on her feet, so she used to bound through the borders and not cause any damage. So once again, I think this is a question of learning to live with your dog rather than planting sturdy plants, particularly if they happen to be poisonous. Another piece of advice I came across was about the surfaces to use for your dog. You know, you don't want your dog's paws to get splintered. Well, mostly you don't want your feet to get splintered. So if your decking is splintering, I think you probably need to repair your decking. The recommendation was to use gravel, and considering that this one certainly thinks that gravel is partly a food, I certainly wouldn't want to put extra gravel in my garden. So I say decking in good condition should be fine. And of course, the best thing for pets and for paws is grass, because it's a lovely soft surface. So if you're thinking about surfaces that are good for dogs, I would say grass is brilliant, but all of the others, if they're in good condition, should be fine. If you are thinking of artificial grass, that can get very, very hot if it's in full sun on very sunny days, so do beware of that. What I do is when I take something out of his mouth, if I can identify it, I do quickly check on Google and say, is magnolia leaf poisonous to dogs? I do think that actually having a puppy is quite worrying. There's obviously lots of hazards here in the garden that could hurt him, but most of them survive, and a year will pass and I hope that he'll be there looking healthy and happy, and he'll have learnt some common sense because we'll have taught it to him. But I'd be interested to know what hazards that you've found are really a problem for puppies. So let me know, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.